Tzaharaim Tovim, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. It is my pleasure and honor to be teaching this class. Again, as Julie indicated, my name is Rabbi Lauren Tuchman. I am based in the Washington, D.C. area, and I have been very drawn to the Piaseczna Rebbe for a long time, particularly to the book that we are going to be looking at today, which is called Aish Kodesh, which was a compilation of Divrei Torah, or Torah commentaries on the weekly Parsha, but these were written while the Piaseczna was in the Warsaw Ghetto. So there's a lot of context of suffering and resilience and navigating really unspeakable challenges. And I wanted to teach this, particularly in this time, as we are navigating so many difficult circumstances. Those are different based on where we are in the world, but we are in a space of just profound change, rupture, disruption, suffering. That suffering manifests very differently for lots of different people, but we're all navigating a challenging moment in our collective human experience. I believe that the Piaseczna has a lot to offer us in this time. I think that the wisdom in this book, in this Sefer, is really enduring. And before we jump in, a couple of things that I really want to state from the outset to frame these series of classes. Today and next week, we are going to be working off of the same text. So I'm only going to be doing the first half or so of the source sheet that you have. The source sheet is only one comment, but it's so dense and requires a lot of contextualization and explanation. And I want us to be able to take our time with it. And I want us to be able to really explore the richness that it has. So during this class, it's going to be mostly frontal, but I am going to offer opportunities for people to jump in and offer comments via the chat box, which Julie will then read a lot of those aloud for the benefit of folks who are not able to access that, and we will interact in that way. Since we are a large group, which is such a blessing, I would like to use the chat box as a way of helping us all engage in the conversation. A couple of other things to note. I'm going to be doing a little bit of an introduction to who the Piaseczna was as a way of understanding his lineage. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Hasidic movement. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of his other books, because he is known as the Warsaw Ghetto Rabbi, but he's actually known for far more than just this Sefer. He might be most famous for it, but it's not the only thing that he composed. In fact, when it was discovered in what was the Warsaw Ghetto after the Shoah and after World War II, after the Holocaust and after World War II, there were other manuscripts of his that were buried with it. And he really wanted, one of the things that he says, the inscription that accompanied the manuscripts that he very carefully buried, was that he wanted his words to be learned by the entire Jewish people. And so I love to think that today he would be amazed at how many students he has. That really that wish that he had, that desire for his Torah to spread in the world, has reached a place that he probably could never have imagined or fathomed. And it's a deep honor, and really it's a privilege. And I just feel so blessed and humbled to be in that lineage as a student, in what small way I can call myself a student. I also would like to give proper kavod, proper honor, to a couple of my teachers from whom I have learned the Piaseczna, and particularly teachers with whom I have learned this text. So there are three teachers in particular that I would like to give kavod to. Rabbi James Jacobson Meisels, who I have learned the Piaseczna with in various contexts, Yitzchak Smith and Rabbi Ami Silver, both of whom, both Yitzchak Smith and Rabbi Ami Silver, have taught me this text in various ways, and so I want to honor them in their teaching as well as I begin my own humble teaching of this really powerful piece. So with that as an introduction, I'm going to talk a little bit about who the Piaseczna Rebbe was. As is true with many Hasidic rabbis, he is known colloquially as the Rebbe of Piaseczna, which was a small town in Poland. And that's where he was mostly based before the war. He's known as the Warsaw Ghetto Rabbi. He's known as the Warsaw Ghetto Rabbi mostly because of this particular text, the Aish Kodesh, which means holy fire. But he is also the author of several other sfarim, several other books, one of which is called Chovavot HaTalmidim, which was a book written for young students about what it means to grow into a well-rounded, holistic human being. And it was meant as a treatise on education, but even more than that, it was meant as a treatise of proper spiritual living, ethical living, moral being in the world, and really just how to actually be a mensch, how to be a holy person, how to be a mensch, how to treat people with proper kavod and proper dignity. So Chovavot HaTalmidim is a very wonderful book if folks have had a chance to look at it. Another book that he wrote that he is very well known for is called B'nei Machshava Tova, which was translated by Andrea Keener as The Conscious Community. And that's a book talking about, it's actually the third in a series of 3 books. And the first one was Chovavot HaTalmidim. And these books were his guide to spiritual practice and spiritual living. And in B'nei Machshava Tova, he talks a lot about how to form a rich spiritual chevra, a rich spiritual society, and what it means to be part of a community of practice that's deeply committed to the inner life and is also deeply committed to self-development. So he has a corpus of work that is related to spiritual practice, to closeness with Hashem, to closeness with God, which that's a theme we're going to be talking a lot about today in this particular piece that we're going to look at. And he also, as I was aforementioning, he also has a book called Aish Kodesh, which means holy fire, and that is a compilation of Divrei Torah that he wrote during his time interned in the Warsaw Ghetto. So, of course, traditional folks who are observant of halakha, traditional Jewish law, excuse me, I apologize, I'm going to put that down. Folks who are observant of traditional Jewish law would not write on the Sabbath. But what a lot of Hasidic rabbis would do is they would have a disciple who would then record as best as they could remember the drash that was given. Most of these drashot were given on Shabbat afternoon, and most of these drashot were given during what's called Sudah Shlishit, or the third meal, which is considered in Hasidic tradition and also in other Jewish spaces to be the holiest time of Shabbat. It's the last hour or two of Shabbat. We are moving out of Shabbat time into weekday time. We are sad at the departure of the Sabbath. And yet we're at the pinnacle of this incredible 25-hour experience. So that was a very popular time for Rebbes to give drashes to their disciples. And that was the case with Piaseczna as well. It's quite remarkable that amidst being in the Warsaw Ghetto, he was able to compose as many drashot as he was able to compose. Many of the drashot that he wrote rely on commentators and teachers before him, which is very common in rabbinic tradition in general, that we always root what we do in what came before. As we provide our own chidushim, as we provide our own interpretations of that which we are teaching, we are also very much rooted in lineage. And what I mean by being rooted in lineage is that we value highly, and when I say we, I mean Jewish tradition writ large, we really value teacher to student transmission of learning. It's very important to know where you learned, who you learned with and from, and also it's an honor to the individual when you lift up the teaching that they gave you in whatever manner they gave you. So we will see that in the beginning of this, in this text we're going to look at, which I'm going to shift into speaking about now. I'm going to read a bit, I'm going to then stop and ask for questions and clarification. I also want folks to feel free to ask if they have questions about a Hebrew term that I use that they may not know. And also I will be doing a lot of explaining because this is a very dense text. It assumes that the person who's reading it knows a lot of the Jewish canon. And it assumes that the person who's reading it understands how the Hasidic tradition rereads the canon. So I'm going to be stopping, I'm going to be interrupting myself quite frequently to give some contextualization. And with that, I'm going to now invite Julie, if you could please do screen share. I am now going to move into this text, which is from Parashat Kitetze, which is a parasha in the book of Deuteronomy. And this was given on September 14th, 1940. It is in reference to the opening pasuk, to the opening verse in Parashat Kitetze, which begins with Kitetze lemilchama, when you go out to war. I mentioned that as context because Rabbi Shapira completely rereads that in a very spiritual way, to mean not about actual physical war, but it becomes a conversation about relational closeness to Hashem. And so one of the things to know when we begin reading Hasidic drashot specifically is that Hasidic rabbis believe deeply that every single word of Torah, and this is normative in non-Hasidic parts of Jewish tradition as well, the idea that Torah is eternally relevant, Shivim Panim LaTorah, 70 pages of Torah, and that we can find meaning in everything, even when it feels opaque, when it feels far away, when it feels not relevant to where we are, we make relevance out of it. We find hidden meanings, we find more levels of meaning that we could even imagine possible. And so that's what the Piaseczna is doing in this drash, really making it a very radical read about Jews and our relationship with God. And I say Jews and our relationship with God, but I think that this is a text that can apply to people of all traditions and to none. And so this is something that I think has just profound spiritual wisdom for everybody, even as it is deeply rooted in a Jewish ethos and in a Jewish mindset. So I'm going to begin to read, and I'm going to, as I said, I'm going to stop myself to explain as we go. So this was taught in September of 1940. It is taught in the name of the holy rabbi, the godly man, the great Maggid of Mezerich. So the Maggid of Mezerich, of blessed memory, was one of the Baal Shem Tov, who was the founder of the Hasidic movement. The Maggid of Mezerich was one of the Baal Shem Tov's closest disciples. It was taught in a verse of Psalms. You are a priest, Kohen, forever. That Kohen refers to the attribute of chesed, loving kindness. So what's going on here? So the Piaseczna is bringing in a pasuk from the book of Psalms, the book of Tehillim, and this is a verse in which God is saying to David HaMelech, to King David, you are a Kohen, which is really odd because David was not a Kohen. And a Kohen in Hebrew means priest. And it refers specifically to the sons of Aaron, the high priest. And so the question emerges, well, what does that actually mean? You are a Kohen. How does that then get translated into chesed? What does this mean? So as I understand this teaching, effectively what the Maggid of Mezerich, who the Piaseczna is quoting, is doing here is talking about the fact that David is not himself a priest, but all of us are given a gift of loving kindness from God, that exists for us forever. And we're going to learn a little bit more about what that gift is. The fact that a person of Israel is capable of saying to God, you are blessed, Baruch atah. This is a chesed from God. So in the verse that this teaching was based around, Ki teitze lemilchama, in English that's translated to when you go out to war. The Maggid of Mezerich, as the Piaseczna is quoting here, takes that you, and instead of talking about the second person when you go out to war, this then gets changed or re-understood or read in a different way to talk about when you as a person engaging in a relational conversation with God, that God allows us as Jewish people, and again, I'm referring to it specifically in Jewish terms, even though I think that this is relevant to people of all traditions, that God enables us to address God's self with the second person, which is pretty religiously significant, because what it's saying here is that human beings are able to have an unmediated relationship with the King of Kings, right? In Jewish tradition, one of the ways we refer to God is the King of Kings. And this idea that you could address a King of Kings, and again, we have many ways of referring to God in Jewish tradition. The Piaseczna here is using a very traditional appellation. It's not the only way we refer to God. There are many, many ways that Jews refer to God. But for the sake of thinking about this drash, the idea of God being King of Kings, we're able to address that beingness with the second person, which is really quite astounding, given that if you had a human royal person or a very important political leader, probably would not be talking to you. We would probably be using a far more formal third person or other kind of formal address. So what the Piaseczna here is talking about is taking this verse and really moving it to helping his community and all of us understand the importance of the spiritual practice of relating to God, relating to the divine, relating to that which is greater than us in a very personal and intimate way. And the reason I wanted to bring this to us today is that it relates, we'll see in a few sentences, it relates to the holiday of Shavuot, because the Piaseczna is going to later talk about revelation and the importance of the individual revelation that we all receive and the collective revelation that we all receive. We have a bit of a paradoxical, or maybe we could call it a dual relationship to Torah, in that we received Torah biklau, we receive Torah in general, and also biprat as individuals. And so the Piaseczna is going to be talking a little bit about that later on. But here, I think the Piaseczna is very, very committed to talking about the ways in which human beings can have an unmediated relationship with God, that God is close to humans, that God is addressed in the second person. And I imagine, although of course I can only conjecture, that this was very significant for the Piasetzna's audience in the Warsaw Ghetto, at a time of tremendous horror that we really can't fathom today. Even as we live in a world that is so complex, with so much uncertainty. And I think that for us today, thinking about the fact that we do not need anything else to be in touch with our innermost self, whether we use God language for that, whether we talk about the divine spark within, whatever it is, we can have that heart-centered relationship, if that's meaningful to us, with God in the way, through our prayers, through whatever spiritual practices work for us, but that we have this ability to be in conversation. We have the ability to pour out our hearts, we have the ability to pour out our souls, and that is something he's really trying, and he's going to continue to talk about this and explain it further, and I'm going to keep going. Because you implies presence, i.e. second person, whereas he, who in Hebrew, the hidden third person. Again, that's a bit of a restatement of what I had said before, that this implies direct presence between us and the divine, that we don't have a hiddenness, but there isn't like a barrier, there isn't a wall erected that, okay, if I'm using the third person who, which means he, then there's like an extra step there. Instead, this is a direct, intimate encounter and relationship. And when the men of the Great Assembly established that in our prayers and blessings, we address God as you, followed by the divine name and kingship, it must mean that these words are effective in bringing about a divine revelation, such that God is actually present before us, and we can truly say, you, and it is not a blessing made in vain, God forbid. So quick moment of explanation here. There are different attributes that make up the traditional brachot in the Jewish liturgy. And without going on too much of a liturgical tangent, when we make a bracha, when we make a blessing, we say, every single blessing we say begins, Baruch atah Hashem, blessed are you, God, Elokeinu melech haolam, our God, ruler of the universe, or the eternal, and then whatever we are blessing. So we have the second person you that we are addressing, blessed are you, and then we move into so we move from the individual, like blessed are you, we're saying that as an individual, Elokeinu, our God, we are then moving into the collective bonds with our Jewish ancestors and our Jewish contemporaries, and then we are talking about kingship, the Melech HaOlam, or Ruach HaOlam, or whatever adjective we describe God's relationship to the universe, and then whatever it is that we're blessing. So what the Piaseczna here is talking about is that this enables, from his perspective, us to each understand revelation as a deeply individual experience without that being a bracha levatala. So bracha levatala means a blessing in vain, which in rabbinic tradition means that the rabbis are really, really very committed to blessings being done very seriously and with purpose. There is an idea that we're supposed to make 100 blessings a day, and those blessings are over food and over arising and when we're praying, and all throughout our day there are ritual activities that the rabbis have determined a blessing accompanies, and in our day we are also finding many more ritual acts and moments in our lives and different experiences we have that warrants blessings. But speaking strictly out of a traditional rabbinic lens, which is where the Piaseczna is rooted and coming from, the rabbis are really very committed to the idea that when we make a blessing, we are thanking God for our ability to interact with the world in a particular way. That it's not our relationship as human beings. This is how I understand this, that it's not our role as human beings to be dominant, that we in fact are co-creators with God in the world, that this is not ours to do with whatever we want. And when we make a blessing, we acknowledge that. We acknowledge that we are part of something larger than we are, and that we are not in fact the center of the universe, and that we owe hoda'ah, we owe gratitude to God who has enabled us to X, Y, or Z. And it provides each act that we bless. It's really about this notion also in Hasidut that we try to elevate the gashmiut, we elevate the physical, we elevate the everyday mundane. That the Jewish way, in terms of spiritual practice, it's not that we go on retreat and just leave the world, although there are plenty of amazing Jewish retreats and I'm a huge fan of them, but we lift up and we elevate the things that we actually engage in our daily lives. And we do that by sanctifying them, and we sanctify through blessing. So when we are sanctifying through blessing, we are not making a blessing in vain. The rabbis do not want people to make blessings just for the sake of making blessings. Blessings are tied to actions. They're tied to actions, they're tied to gratitude. One gratitude practice, of course, is Birchot HaShachar in the morning gratitude blessings. But those are also tied to various human abilities and actions and things of that nature. So the Piaseczna here is saying that when we are addressing God as you, we are enabled to have a holy individual relationship with God, and that is not a misuse of our power of blessing. So I'm going to read for a few more minutes, and then I'm going to open it up to questions and comments and explanations. This relates to what is taught in our holy books, that just as prayer requires Torah, as the verse says in Proverbs, one who turns their ear away from hearing Torah, their prayer is also despicable. So too, Torah requires prayer. What I have come to understand in this part, which it might at first blush feel really like, wait, if you turn your ear away from Torah, your prayer is despicable, what does this mean? The Piaseczna here is talking about relationship with God as being a two-way street. And this may resonate, it may not resonate. I am simply presenting this as an explanation of the teaching. The notion that if I am totally disinterested in Torah, I'm not interested in being close to Torah, and Torah, as I understand it, and I'm speaking for my own understanding of this teaching, Torah is broad. Torah really comes from the Hebrew root meaning teaching and instruction. So Torah is broad. If I am hostile or I am not interested in understanding Torah or in being in relationship with Torah, because that's what is saying, well then why should God have any interest in what I have to say? Now that feels really harsh to a lot of folks, and it doesn't always sit well with me either. But I think one way to think about it, which I think can be very, very helpful in this moment, and this is why I really want to lift this piece up, is that if I am only interested in what I have to say, why would anybody be interested in listening to me if I myself have no desire to hear what they have to say? I think that in this world in which we are coming to understand at a profound level every day that human beings experience the world in vastly different ways. And sometimes when we are witness to stories of unfathomable pain and suffering and hardship and rage and anger, it's hard to hear. If all I want to do is talk about what I think, and I'm not willing to witness, I'm not willing to hear, and I'm not willing to internalize what the other person is sharing, well then why should what I have to say be of any consequence if I am not in that exchange? And that is what the Piaseczna here is saying on the spiritual level as well. That it's about humility, it's about service, it's about being part of a collective. That ultimately, ours is a spirituality that is deeply collective and deeply individual simultaneously. We all have the same Sfarim, we all have the same books of Torah. The words in every Sefer Torah, in every synagogue in the world are exactly the same, but we are all understanding them profoundly differently. And if we walk away from the conversation, it's hard to continue the conversation. And this can be understood according to what we said above. For we say, blessed are you, Hashem, who teaches Torah to your nation Israel, meaning to the entire nation. But for God to learn or teach with each individual person and speak to each and everyone, each person needs to make that happen. So we get in what we get out what we put in other words. That's how I understand this. We get into our pursuits, we get out of our pursuits what we put into them. I can't expect to, and this is something that is very real in my personal life, so I can't expect that I can learn yoga poses simply by going through one yoga class, right? So too, I can't expect to master a sense of Jewish tradition if all I do is read one commentary. That really what the Piaseczna here I think is really encouraging us to say is that we have to make this happen. We have to make Torah relevant in our own lives. Torah is there for us as a collective, but we as individuals, we have the responsibility, the sacred responsibility and the sacred privilege to make it actually relevant for us, and that's only something we can do. In the opening verses of Vayikra, in the book of Leviticus, Rashi comments, so Rashi was a famous French biblical commentator, it was a voice to him, a voice directed to him. Him here is Moses, directed to him alone. Moshe heard it, so the first words of the book of Leviticus, Sefer Vayikra, are, and he called, so when God called Moses, it and the rest of Israel did not hear. So Moses heard a particular way of being. Moses heard God's revelation in his way, meaning, and here's the meaning of exactly what that was, meaning that Moshe Rabbeinu also heard the voice to him, the voice directed to him alone in an intimate and private communication to him. So how we relate to Torah is very deeply personal. And the rest of Israel, even though Hashem teaches together with them, it is not to them or directed to them individually. Rather, God teaches Torah to the nation, to the entire collective of Israel. So again, this might be a little bit complicated to understand. We are really drilling down here on the paradox, which one of the reasons I wanted to teach you this today is because it relates very much to Shavuot. The idea, some of you may be familiar with this, that there is a midrash that says that all Jews were at Sinai to receive revelation. That is the collective teaching of Torah that the Piaseczna here is referring to, that Hashem has taught the Torah collectively to the entire nation. And he's not citing this midrash, I'm bringing in this midrash as my understanding of the teaching. The midrash that talks about all souls being at Sinai also then talks about the Shiv'im Panim LaTorah, the 70 faces of Torah, that every single one of us heard the revelation, but we heard it in a way that we were able to understand it and implement it in our individual lives. And that we each have a haleg, which the Piaseczna is going to talk about later, an individual part of Torah that really speaks to us and that we have understood in a way that no one else can understand. And each and every person needs to bring about that Hashem speaks with them individually too, as we described above. And how can one make this happen? Through prayer. When a person says you and affects a divine revelation that is present to them, and then Hashem speaks to them and teaches Torah to them individually, likewise with the language of you in presence. So I'm going to stop there. So again, the invocation of the second person you is about presence. When we are engaged in connective prayer, which the word tefillah in Hebrew also, and he probably assumed that folks knew this, I'm going to bring this in because I don't know if this is a background assumption that the Piaseczna is making, but the word tefillah actually comes, it's a reflexive, lahit palel is a reflexive word in Hebrew for prayer, and in Jewish tradition it's really understood as connective, that prayer is fundamentally about connecting deeply to God. We have about 10 minutes remaining in our session today, and I'm going to, that was a lot. I'm going to stop the teaching there. I'm going to open it now to questions and comments. Next week, we are going to review what we've done, and we're going to continue with this drash. So if anyone has any comments or questions that they want to put into the chat, I am happy to answer them, or if anybody wants any explanation, I'm also happy to do that as well.
Folks can direct their chat to me in the chat box. Okay, we have a question from Maxine. Was the Warsaw Ghetto at its lowest point when he wrote this? It seems this was very early in the period of the ghetto.
Maxine, thank you so much for that question, because I had intended to talk about that at the beginning of this year. So thank you so much. So he finishes the last piece in Aish Kodesh was Parashat Chazon, which is the or Shabbat Chazon rather, which is right before Tisha B'Av. So this is certainly earlier in the period. There's no question that this was a drash that was given earlier. Things were not great in the ghetto, but it had not seen its worst years yet. And I think that's actually very important to name. That so much of where we are as people in the world, as teachers of Torah, as learners of Torah, a lot of that affects how we then teach the text. A lot of our internal experiences and external experiences, and we're going to see that later in the third session. We're going to be learning a piece on Parashat Chayei Sarah from 1939, which the Piaseczna wrote very shortly after losing several family members. And the tenor is very different there. And it will be very interesting to compare these two pieces, the Kitetze piece and the Chayei Sarah piece.
Okay, we have a couple more questions. Perhaps you addressed this in what you just said, but someone was asking how his being in the Warsaw Ghetto affected the way he interprets Torah. And then, a bunch of questions are coming in. Okay, what's the difference between a bracha, a blessing that begins only with Baruch Atah Hashem, and a bracha that includes Eloheinu melech haolam, I guess Asher Kidshanu b'mitzvotav?
Yeah, wonderful question. I am pulling out of my archives in my brain all that I learned in liturgy in rabbinical school, so forgive me if I misquote anything. We, in the Jewish tradition, as it has come down in the Siddur, so now I'm talking about the traditional prayer book, which has many variants today. It's always had many variants, but one of the things that is very standard, whether you're using a very progressive Siddur, whether you're using a more traditional Siddur, whether you're looking in Hebrew or in English translation or in any other language translation, there are different kinds of blessings. And there are specific terms for them, which are eluding me at this moment. There are specific terms that scholars use to refer to shorter blessings and longer blessings. So for example, if you had a bracha like Baruch Atah Hashem, Asher Bachar Banu Mikol Mi, but that's a Lana Torah, like blessed are you Hashem, who chose us from all the peoples and gave us the Torah. That's a bracha of gratitude. That's how I understand that bracha. We are thanking God for Torah, as opposed to a bracha like Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu l'hadlik ner shel Shabbat, which might be familiar to some of you. Blessed are you, God, who has sanctified us with God's mitzvot and has commanded us to light the Shabbat candles. So blessings can be coming from a place of gratitude, and they also can supersede a physical action. And when they do that, they elevate that physical action to a more spiritual place than it had before.
Thank you. Okay, here's a question from Meryl. What if you're Jewish and you don't feel this personal connection to God? Is there anything we can do to feel a connection?
Thank you so much, Meryl, for that question. I think it's very important to address it. In that, I think for a lot of us, it's very difficult to feel this. Very, very difficult. Especially, I would say, especially as American Jews. I don't presume to know where you're from, but I would say that many American Jews have inherited a certain kind of ambivalence to thinking about having a direct relationship with Hashem, because it's seen as something that others do, but that we don't do. So what can we do if we're not feeling that direct connection? One of the practices that Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, who is another Hasidic Rebbe, one of the earliest Hasidic Rebbes, he has a practice called Hitbodedut, which comes from the Hebrew word for seclusion or solitude. And it's a practice where ideally you go into nature, although it can happen anywhere, and it's unscripted in your native language, just speaking your mind to God, to the universe, to whatever. And one of the things that he talks about in his teaching about Hitbodedut is that if you're feeling so distant and you feel like you just can't even connect to God in this way, or that this individual relationship feels so far away, that your Hitbodedut can be, God, I don't know why I'm doing this. I don't feel this. Maybe I'd like to feel it. I don't know how to feel it. What can I do to feel it? But I also think that, the Piaseczna is teaching in his particular context, which is not going to work for everybody in the same way. So if we're thinking that, having this immediate conversation with Hashem feels so hard, I know in my own spiritual life it feels extremely difficult, I always think of this as an aspiration. I think that's part of what is happening here, is that we are aspiring to this, because the spiritual life is not always on an upswing, that we are humans. We have an entire palette of emotions. Sometimes we are feeling incredible despair, and that is the truth that we are holding. And I think that is the truth that many of us are holding today. Sometimes we are feeling a lot of joy. Sometimes we're feeling both joy and despair. And we can hold all those things. But when we can't find, or we don't resonate, or we don't connect with the idea of an individual conversation, perhaps we can take this as a tool to think about deep listening as a radical act when we are talking with other human beings. So thinking about what the Piaseczna says about, if Torah requires prayer and prayer requires Torah, and he understands that, of course, in a way to say that if I'm not interested in what Torah, which is the container for everything, has to teach me, well, then why should Hashem or the Torah be interested in what I have to say? If that doesn't work, that doesn't resonate in the way that he's describing. I think the deeper practice, or another way to understand it, is if I'm having a difficult relationship with somebody, or I'm just having a rough day, and who among us in this Corona time has not experienced the worst of what we can be? If I am only interested in expressing my views, I have no interest in hearing you, I have no interest in engaging, and all I want to do is shout, then maybe this is asking us, and it's not possible with everybody and everything, and I don't think that spiritual practices are meant to be always applicable in every context, but perhaps this is asking, when possible, for us to still our minds, to really go inward, to ask us to deeply listen and to radically engage in conversation as a way of experiencing revelation, whether we think of that as divine or whether we think of revelation as, oh, now I understand more what this person's trying to say, or now I understand more what this person's background is or where they're coming from. So I hope that that's helpful.
Great. We probably have time for one or two more questions.
Yeah, I'll take one or two more.
Yeah, sorry that we won't get to all of the questions. It's great to see that there are so many, and we hope to continue the conversation next week. I'll give you one slightly easier one and one maybe more challenging one. The first is, if we're curious to read more about the Piaseczna Rebbe, what might we read? What would you recommend to read? And then the other question is, where did it go? Oh, could you expand on the notion that revelation is a partnership between humanity and the divine? And how do you think how do you think the rabbi views that and its long-term implications from generation to generation?
Yeah, so in terms of, I'll take the first one, and then I will try to answer the second one quickly, although I'm going to probably pick it up next week because it deserves a much longer answer than we have time for. So if you are interested in the Piaseczna, there are some English translations of a few of his works. One of them is Conscious Community. It is available, I know, electronically on Kindle. It is a translation of B'nai Machshava Tova. I think it's a fantastic book. It's called Conscious Community. That's one thing to check out. Another thing to check out is Holy Fire, which is the English translation of Aish Kodesh. And then Nehemiah Poland, who I believe is at Hebrew College, wrote a book that explores the background on a lot of the Piasetzna's teachings. So if you go to any bookstore or ebook distributor and just type in Warsaw Ghetto Rabbi or Piaseczna Rabbi, those things should pop up. There are also, if you Google, there are a couple of online resources. And there's also actually a Facebook group, if you're interested, called Piaseczna Rebbe. So that's a group where folks who study the Rebbe will include a lot of resources and different kinds of things that they've looked at. And so that's another way for people to connect. And so the second question about revelation. So I want to take the second half of that question because I think it's a very important question. We cannot know, right? And this is part of the humility of teaching this. We only have the words that we have from Rabbi Shapiro, right? The long-term implications of this notion of a partnership between Hashem and humanity as revelation and how that moves from generation to generation, I don't know how the Piaseczna would think about how our tradition is changing so dramatically, right? Because he was in a position, he lived in a time when he was very committed to upholding observance of halacha. He was very committed to spirituality. He was very committed to the inner life. He was very worried about people who were leaving Hasidut. The intro to his book called Chavavot Talmidim, which I referenced earlier, is very much, it's directed at parents and teachers, and it was written in 1932. And at that time, a lot of youth in Poland were leaving the Hasidic world. And the Piaseczna is very worried about that. And he talks a lot about that. And he talks about what are the reasons for that. So he is deeply invested, so far as I understand, in maintaining loyalty and fealty to tradition, but not dryly. He's very committed to the cultivation of the neshama, of the soul. So I can't comment on how he would think about non-Orthodox Judaism. I can't comment on any of the ways in which we have blossomed into so many different pathways today. I would hope that he would be excited about the manifestations, but of course I can't know, although I ask that a lot. And in terms of the partnership between human beings and God, so the revelation is a paradox. We received the same revelation, generally. So Torah, as we have it in books, as we have it from our teachers, as we have it literally in the Sefer Torah, which is in the Aron HaKodesh, in the Holy Ark in synagogues, that Torah is the same. Literally, the physical words on the physical cloth are the same on the physical parchment. But if we want to internalize Torah and all that it can teach us, that is when the intimate connection and partnership between us and God comes. So for example, I'll use myself as an example, right? I am very drawn to thinking about what Torah can teach us about dignity, about kavod habriot, and particularly around disability. So I have a particular understanding of a passage in the book of Exodus, which I won't go into because it's a side point, but you can look at my website and I have a lot of stuff on there about that, about God and Moses and their dialogue around Moses having some sort of speech disability. And that feels really intuitive to me. And that he would understand as my chaleg in Torah, that there is a piece of Torah, there's something that we latch onto as people, as individuals, that really has deep wisdom and meaning for us, may not have deep wisdom and meaning for others, and it has deep wisdom and meaning for us that it can't have for someone else, because we have a piece in the enduring chain of Torah, that we are able to bring that piece that really resonates with us into how we learn and teach Torah and live Torah, and that really helps the revelation of Torah become that much richer. That's how I understand that.